professional. Okay, just about to change virtual screen. Okay. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Sociology of Media Voices series for 2022. We are very privileged today to speak to somebody who is doing a lot of work within our community spaces and is as a pioneer in that they are leading the way forward for people who identify as First Nations within Australia, a way forward into better health outcomes. I have an absolute pleasure to welcome to our space today, AJ Williams. And as we begin, AJ, if you could please tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, hi, thank you for chatting with me. My name's AJ Williams. My background's Wiradjuri and Wotjobulak. So my family come from Dimboola Horsham area, Dubbo area of New South Wales. I'm a dad. I've got two kids. I'm a husband, I'm a son, I'm a brother to 4 brothers, and I'm a mental health accredited social worker, and also a nurse and a youth worker.
That's incredible. And tell us a little bit about your journey in social work. What sort of drove you to go pursue that career?
Well, my first qualification was as a nurse, and I fell into nursing by accident to start off with. I was living on the street in Sydney in a place called Belmore, and I was living in a squat, not far from the hospital. And the guys I was squatting with came back to the squat and said, "We've got jobs as all these at the hospital. We're moving to nurses' quarters. Do you want to come?" And I went, "Yep, sure. That sounded like a great place to move into." And I went to the interview, and the matron saw something in me and offered me a nursing training. So I did that for initially. I got injured by a client after I became a nurse. And it's really hard to be a nurse and not be able to lift with a back injury. So I really enjoyed helping people. I was specialising in mental health and maternal health in nursing, and I really enjoyed the mental health side of it. So I actually went back and said, well, how else can I actually help people in a way of listening to their stories and help navigate them through life in different ways. So that's what made me actually thinking about going into social work. One, I loved hearing stories. One, I like the difference between empowering and providing self-resilience to people in helping them make decisions and life decisions. And that's probably the major reason that I got into social work. One, because of my back injury, but two, because I like helping people see different ways of actually navigating themselves.
And what was your journey like, just going back to nursing, identifying as an Indigenous person? Did you find that there were other people who were also doing nursing at that time who were Indigenous?
I actually didn't know anybody that was Indigenous while I was doing nursing. And it's not that I didn't disclose my Aboriginality. I found it quite difficult in the time. Like, we are going back 30 years now to when I did nursing, and my colleagues, in my first or second week, there was an Aboriginal patient that came into the ward, and the nursing staff made really derogatory comments about them. Like, actually, I won't say exactly what they said, but it was not very nice at all. And me, just being 17 at the time, found it really difficult to kind of stand up to the charge nurse and the preceptors and actually go, no, this is not acceptable. It wasn't until my final year that we actually had an Aboriginal patient on the ward who was from Bundjalung country, where I grew up, and I knew a little tiny bit of Bundjalung language, not a lot, just how are you okay? And it was enough to calm her down, because she was old and a little bit demented, and she kept referring back into language. And while I was sitting there next to her, just holding her hand and repeating the same, because my very limited language, it was just calming her down. And one of the nurses came up to me and said, "Oh, what are you doing? What are you talking about?" I go, "Oh, I'm talking a Bunjalung," to her. And she said, "Oh, what do you mean? What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, this is an Aboriginal language." And they said, "So how do you know it?" I go, "Oh, I'm Aboriginal." I was like, "Well, when did you become one?" And by this stage, I'm a little bit more tougher and a bit stronger. My initial response was, "Well, they had a drive down in the cafeteria at lunchtime, so I just decided to join."
Oh.
I signed up this afternoon, and I actually went, "Look, I've always been Aboriginal. I just haven't felt comfortable in sharing that information with you." And then they kind of said, "Well, why wouldn't you?" And I said, "Well, I've never heard any of you come up and say, 'Hi, I'm Mary, I'm Greek. Hi, I'm Brian, I'm Czechoslovakian.' I go, I don't normally go, 'Hi, I'm AJ and I'm Aboriginal.'" But when I didn't want to disclose because of the derogatory comments I actually heard from my peers at the time, and they first kind of tried to deny it, and I actually went, "No, I'm calling you out on it and saying this is why I didn't self-identify." But I've always kind of known that I was an Aboriginal kid, especially not so much when I was a younger kid, but when I was like 14 and above. I really understood it more when a child protection worker kind of explained it to me that you are Aboriginal and you're going under our Aboriginal program kind of thing. But now I kind of understand a little bit more. And I actually had a couple of good Aboriginal friends at high school that were quite supportive and allowed me to learn about culture at the same time as being self-identifying as well. And their families kind of took me in as being one of the Aboriginal kids, if that makes sense.
And just going back now, AJ, to that journey into nursing, and there was a period of time when nursing was done in unhospital spaces. Can you reflect a little bit on your training? Were there any components that talked about cultural sensitivity within nursing practice at that time when you were being trained?
Well, we actually got a manual, a typewritten manual that says how to work with an Aborigine.
Oh, God. Okay.
So it says it had very clear instructions: do not make eye contact with them, speak slowly and clearly, try not to have too many family members in the room because it might cause cross-infection.
Oh.
Yeah, this was the
We
manual.
laugh, everybody. We're both laughing because we kind of, we're both relating to that, that period of time when things were written in such a way. How did that sort of, when you read those words on paper, AJ, at that time, was it something that you just took it for granted that this is the world that we live in at that period of time, that was seen as something very different?
Yeah, I think so. Look, part of me was probably a little bit upset. I mean that. But the other part was kind of me going, "Oh my God, like really, they've got no idea how to actually understand what Aboriginality looks like." And I do think even at the time then, me being the skin color that I am, they wouldn't even have known my Aboriginality, let alone if I could try to raise it with anybody. And I probably at the time too, because I was 17, 18, 19 when I was doing nursing. So it was like, was I also strong enough to be able to voice it? Like me now, happy to voice it. But then at the time, I don't even know if I had the words to actually confront management or the hospital going, "What the hell is this document? What is working with an Aborigine 101 as a context?" But no, nothing in my course talked anything about working with any culture, really. It was very Western, very white-ish.
And when you decided to take that leap into social work, at that period when you completed your social work qualifications, was there any mention of First Nations perspective about care and representation in health services when you were doing your social work course?
Actually, no, very little.
Oh, okay.
Very, very little. I graduated in social work in 1997, and I went to Victoria University. They were very big on feminist practice, very big on community development, but all the concepts are very kind of general. And we had an elective to do, and I chose to do an elective in Aboriginal issues at Melbourne University.
Oh,
And so I went over to Melbourne University to do an elective on Aboriginal community development, and brought that information back to VU at the time. I am aware now that VU has, because my brother is at the moment doing a social work course at VU, my little brother, and he is doing an Aboriginal unit as we speak. So he was saying that a lot of the subjects have got an Indigenous component in it, which is great, because when I did it, there was no Indigenous component. There was a lot of discussion around diversity, a lot of discussion around inclusion, a lot of discussion around cold communities, but very little about anything to do with Indigenous issues. But I would also say too, at the time, there was very little to do with gender issues as well. While I was doing my social work degree at BU, I was also doing my arts degree, and I did first and second year of arts, and I was specialising in gender studies, which was in feminist studies at BU. So it was quite interesting that that wasn't always reflected in the social work course at the time. You actually had to go external to another department, another subject, to get the Indigenous context, to get the gender specific information, if that makes sense, because it wasn't part of the social work course that I did.
And it's good to see that it's now sort of embedded within practice, which it should have been all along, but I guess it's an evolving system of people trying to understand what social work encompasses. Your journey into social work, was there anything challenging that you found that when you started practicing as a social worker?
I think the hardest part was to find a job to start off with, and my first job was in child protection, and child protection, people know, or social workers know, you can always kind of get a job in child protection to start off with. Being a kid that grew up myself, in that having a child protection worker was a little bit difficult at times. I found that I was actually quite good at my role I did it for a year and a half. So I did it for the first 8 months, 9 months, really, really quite well. But then slowly I thought my history, I saw the endless cycle of clients coming through. I saw the generational issues of their family who'd been through the system. And I kind of realized that the system was broken. And I still don't know if 27 years later, whether it's actually changed a lot. But I did see the real need for, as I said, helping people navigate the systems. Like once I learned how the systems work, then I could actually work with clients to actually work out, well, how do we actually navigate some of this stuff? Because some of these systems we can't change. How do we actually learn about them and navigate our way through them? So I always think of myself as a navigator. And, some people say that, you're a leader. And I go, well, I am a leader in some ways, but not always the leader at the front. I can be the leader from behind or the side, holding your hand and taking you through this journey. Or I can be the leader from behind, giving you a good push up the hill.
And your practice social work, what sort of led you to change slight direction with your social work?
After 12 months, I wanted to do something really different. And then I went over to Victoria University myself, and I worked as the disability liaison in the Equity and Social Justice unit, and I did that for 3 years. And I watched students come into the university with disabilities. We would support them while they're on campus, but then again, I'm really big at systems and realised that we don't actually support the students to get jobs and move on. And so I got involved with the student careers unit at Victoria University, and we started working on a program to help students with disabilities move into employment afterwards. And then I got a job in student careers. So I moved over to student careers and I stayed there for another 3 years. And in that time, we're also creating programs with the Aboriginal unit in order to help students with from an Indigenous background have career counselling and help them prepare for the workforce, because we find that a lot of the universities really support students while on campus, but when their course finishes, at the time, there wasn't a lot of support afterwards, if that makes sense. So my job is to help create some afterwards kind of support that they could still access and tap into.
And what did you say was the biggest challenge that a student who identifies Indigenous faces once they've graduated?
Having confidence to apply for jobs, having a lot of, sometimes many were the first that have ever completed a university degree to start off with. We do know that even today, it's still the first generations of Aboriginal kids getting to year 12. It's still the first generations of Aboriginal kids actually completing a university degree. So some of these students didn't actually have any role models in families. It was also talking to them a lot about work ethics and what it's like to actually work in a workplace, and how different it is from a student. That you do actually have to turn up on time. You do actually have to be prepared. You do have to have a commitment to the organisation. You need to be able to demonstrate that to employer, but also helping Aboriginal people learn to talk about themselves, because for a lot of First Nations people, me is not normally a topic of conversation to actually hold. So to get a job, I need to be able to sell something that I don't normally talk about. So it was trying to get people to see themselves as a product. And if I want to sell myself to a future employer, how would I sell that product? How would I sell myself? And so giving people the strength, the confidence, and the wording and the words to actually be able to do that.
Was there ever a time when you wondered whether one should disclose that they were Indigenous when they were going for a position? Was it seen as a hindrance or as a form of bias, racism, or did you feel that it's important to kind of voice that?
Look, I always say to people, it depended on the job. I mean, if they're going for an Aboriginal specific job, disclose it. But sometimes it's hard not to disclose it, depending if you worked somewhere else before. Like if you've been working, if your job description, if your CV clearly says, I've been working at the Aboriginal Health Service and I've done Aboriginal advisory and I've sat on a reconciliation committee, people can probably pick up that you're possibly Aboriginal. After I left student careers at the BU, I went off to do work as Indigenous employment coordinator at 3 organisations. So I actually saw it from the other side, where I would see the racism actually occur with organisations that say, yes, we've got a reconciliation plan, or an Indigenous employment strategy, we want to increase Indigenous employment, but then still finding it very hard to place Indigenous people in different areas across the organisation because the stereotypes that the managers had, like, oh my God, you bring one of them in and they'll have a whole corroboree happening in the office. Oh, they're very lazy. They won't turn up on time. I've heard that they go off to funerals all the time. And so those stereotypes I could actually personally hear, which became a barrier. But then I could twist that around to actually say to people, this is why. Do you want to disclose at this particular moment in time? Do you, because you don't have to? And then some people, when they write their resume, might want to actually disclose all that, but I would actually have to have conversations with them. Do you feel culturally safe at this particular moment before you've got the job to disclose this, and giving person the right to actually identify or not identify at that particular moment. They might want to identify at the interview once they get to the interview, but do they want to identify through the application process? But the biggest thing that I would always do is actually have those conversations with people, because it's their right to choose when they want to disclose.
So it looks as though your whole journey from work so far has been, you sort of fell into nursing, fell in love with the notion of care, got into social work, which is about care. Then you went into careers and employment, disability, which is about care. So that for me, I see there's that underlying theme that you really are passionate about wanting to support people through the life cycle journey. And what then led you from that, AJ, to then establish your successful space that you have created now?
Well, during my nursing, I specialised in mental health. And so mental health, the two passions I've got is increasing mental health literacy, but also helping Aboriginal people have culturally safe spaces in workplaces and in community services organisations and in workplace and as clients. So from a mental health perspective, I've always been interested in mental health. I was a kid that grew up having bulimia, so I was in and out of hospital. I live with anxiety disorder. So the mental health understanding from a young person, from a client, myself, I purely understood. I got into, I'm a mental health accredited social worker, so I've been endorsed to be able to undertake mental health assessments with people. I do have a counselling role. I often work with young Aboriginal adolescents that have had suicide attempts or engage in non-suicidal self-injury. And I do a lot of self-resilient mentoring programs at schools,
Oh, okay.
often with young Aboriginal men. I've been a mental health first aid instructor for since 2008. And for 6 years, I actually worked at Mental Health First Aid Australia as their national program manager, helping to create a lot of the curriculum for the Edition 2 version of the course. So I've always had a passion for mental health. I love being a mental health first aid instructor because it's about breaking stereotypes. It's about community don't know, and I mean mental health first aid instructor in the youth, the standard, the Aboriginal, so all streams, but I'm pretty passionate about the Aboriginal space because it is something that our community don't really know about and don't often talk about. Yet we have one of the highest populations of people with diagnosis of mental illness and the highest rates of suicide. So it's about breaking stereotypes. It's about pushing boundaries. It's about having discussions that we don't normally have discussions about. And one thing I love is that when people come to my workshops, is that sometimes they don't know what they're expecting, but they walk out going, "Oh my God, I didn't know what I didn't know, and now that I know this stuff, knowledge is power, and knowledge can save people's lives." One of the biggest things that people learn in the course is around talking about suicide. And a lot of elders will say to me that, "Oh no, AJ, I could never talk about suicide with somebody," until they do the course, until they can understand what depression does to somebody or what anxiety does to somebody and how this could lead them to have these thoughts and how suicide could be an option for somebody. Those words that they offer somebody, like asking directly, "Are you thinking about suicide? Is there anything I can help you with?" Breaking that and allowing people the opportunity to say that you can say those things changes a person's confidence in actually having conversations with people. And that's what I love about mental health first aid, is nothing more than a conversation, but it is a conversation that can save a person's life. And so I've delivered nearly 600 mental health first aid courses over the period of 2008. And I'm also a deadly thinking instructor, which is a different program.
Yeah.
Which is a much more simpler program than mental health first aid, but it is a program that introduces a lot of those concepts in a yarning style.
Okay.
And we've implemented those in the schools that I actually do training with. So, and my son is a deadly thinking instructor as well.
Oh, so it's followed in Dad's footsteps, so to speak.
Yep, he's a youth worker as well, and last year he won 2 NAIDOC awards for Youth of the Year in 2 different regions of Melbourne.
That's so incredible.
So I'm actually quite proud of his achievements.
Absolutely, and it's a wonderful role model for other young Indigenous people growing up, that there is ways that we can feel proud about ourselves and there's supports available. And within that space, and that's something I'm really excited to share with everyone listening, if people were interested to, especially with the your training in that yarning in schools, it will put the links, of course, to your websites. How do they get in touch with you?
Schools. I'm actually also involved. I'm doing involved a lot of things, but I actually also work as a consultant for Independent Schools Victoria.
Okay. Yep.
As well. So I'm helping them with their reconciliation action plan and starting to do webinars for schools around reconciliation process and how to actually engage with young Indigenous people. And when I'm talking about young, I'm talking anywhere between primary school and year 12, looking at strategies to help teachers, strategies to help counselling services, looking at how to change curriculum or review curriculum. They're all things that the Education Department says they're going to do. And I think schools still need the understanding and being able to get people to practically see how to do that, if that makes sense. Again, without making it tokenistic. So it's not like, how do we introduce Indigenous issues into maths without it being something like Johnny had 3 boomerangs and Paul had 4 boomerangs. How many boomerangs do we have? Or, in how do we implement it into the home economics without going, oh, let's put lemon myrtle into every ingredient, into every recipe. But how do we really embed those things in ways that aren't just tokenistic or tick a box kind of things? So, I'm, as I said, people can access some of those workshops through ISV, or they can contact me through my own business at Girraway Ganyi Consultancy, which was established about 12 years ago, and helping to increase mental health literacy and cultural awareness initially across Victoria. I started my business as something for the western suburbs of Melbourne because I was living on that side of the city. I was actually working at one of the local Aboriginal services at the time, and one thing that my role was about is helping organisations connect with the organisation. And we realised that not one of the 32 home and care organisations had actually had cultural awareness. And my workplace at the time didn't want to provide cultural awareness. And I was working part-time. So I started delivering cultural awareness to those 32 organisations in the western suburbs. And within 2 years, I kind of had worked my way through the western suburbs kind of organisations to then working across Victoria and then across Australia. So I do work across Australia, helping organisations with reconciliation action plans, with mental health wellbeing programs in workplaces, and providing mentoring and support for Aboriginal staff in those organisations on individual and group levels as well.
That's just absolute. I'm just blown away by your work and how you fit that all in. And I guess this is part of the journey I wanted to raise to everyone. Now, as a result of all your work, I hear you were last year, am I correct? You were bestowed an award from the Australian Australian Social Workers Association.
Yep, I actually won the 2021 Aboriginal Social Worker of the Year award.
Mm.
It was an inaugural award as well, so it was the first one.
Really? So you're the first Indigenous. That's incredible, an achievement, I have to say. When you received that, did it part of you reflect back to when you were that young boy, you know, who was 14, 15, thinking, here I am today, and I'm probably one of the most highly regarded social workers in Australia?
I would say a little bit, and I think the issue is that as a kid growing up, I was bullied a lot. I had an eating disorder. I was struggling with my cultural identity,
Mm,
and I look now that after all, even though I've been through all that, I've never done anything for, yes, the glory. I want the award. I want the acknowledgement kind of thing. But especially the AAW award, that was
mm,
peer assessed.
mm.
So it wasn't just, you know, popping in an application and the AAW. It was actually peer assessed by Aboriginal um, people on the panel that actually have just recognised my work as something that not just in the clinical practice, but in the education sphere and in the research sphere as well. I do work I'm a cultural consultant for the Butterfly Foundation,
Mm,
for the National Eating Disorders Collaboration, for the Australian New Zealand Eating Disorders Academy. And I'm doing research projects with them at the moment, trying to increase, again, awareness of eating disorders in the Aboriginal community. Because again, there's not a lot of research done in those particular areas, but we are seeing such high increase in incidence of eating disorders that we need to find out a lot about how to work with young or Aboriginal people with eating disorders, because there's very few clinical guidelines to help professionals understand the culture and understand the trauma and understand the history, because you just don't wake up in the morning and have an eating disorder.
mm.
There's lots of underlying trauma, there's lots of underlying issues that a person is going through. And I don't think, again, that's taught in courses at all. Does that make sense? Like you talked to me
Yeah.
about before about what's missing from my social work course 20 years ago. I still think there's a lot of stuff missing in courses in terms of understanding the recency of some of this history and how it still impacts on people today. What I mean by that is that we can easily learn history. That's not a problem. I can throw dates at people and go, 1967 there was a referendum, and 2008 there was an apology. But what do those events actually? How do those events actually impact on Aboriginal people today? How does that impact on their understanding of how the world works? How does that impact on their ability to self-identify or not identify? How does that impact on their social emotional well-being and on their mental health? Or how does that impact on their ability to seek help and get the help that's required? Because often those courses don't teach that connection. They teach the historical event as a historical event, and people walk away believing that stuff happened years ago and has nothing to do with themselves. Because you'll hear that all the time. This had nothing to do with me. That was decades ago, or that wasn't in my generation. Or they can't understand how some of those things where they place in history are really quite recent. Like it's not that, like stolen generations of things that are like depending on how you're defining it, yes, there were historical stolen generations from the early half-caste acts that were created. But if kids are still being removed from culture now at high levels, and we know that Aboriginal kids are 8 times more likely to be in child protection and 15 times more likely to be in juvenile justice settings, if those kids today are still denied access to community, family, and culture, then they are still part of the stolen generations, but making it very clear that there are different generations of stolen, and stolen means many different things. It can be forcibly removed. It can be removed under any government intervention and being denied access back to family, community, and culture. It could mean that a parent may prevent you from actually being connected to culture if you're like, if one parent's not Indigenous, now that one is, and not allowing you to explore that, that's still being taken away from you. So I always think about stolen generations, not just about the historical concepts that we've got, but also about people being denied access back to family, community, and culture in the present.
It's been an incredible journey listening to your journey in terms of what you've been through and what you've given back to the community. I guess the final reflection I'd love to ask you is, what advice would you give to, say, a 14-year-old person out of home care who's of First Nations heritage, who may be struggling at the moment?
Look for 2 things. Look for role models. Look for people that are actually people that you admire, people that you trust. Don't be scared to reach out to them. Don't be scared to actually have a conversation and tell them, hey, I'm struggling. What is it that you can do to actually help me not be in this circumstance at this particular moment? What pathways can I actually use? Hopefully being able to pick up a mentor, whether that's through a school situation, whether that's through a co-op kind of situation, or through a cultural lens. Looking at as many options as you possibly can. And I know that schools will sometimes go, oh, you must go off to university, you must do this, you must. Looking at, there's such a broad range of life out there. And I always say to people now, looking back on my life, you can be whatever you want to be. You can dream, but you can also reach those dreams. Sometimes we just need a little bit of help and steering to get to those dreams. Sometimes we're on a train to those dreams. We get off at the wrong station for a little bit. Explore the station for a little bit, but then hop back on that train, because it's going to get you to your dream. Yeah. And never give up. Never give up is the other thing.
AJ, it's been an absolute pleasure and honour to speak with you. And for everyone listening, we will put all the links up so you can contact AJ through their social media handles, and as well book it if you would like for yourself and perhaps your team to, if you have First Nations teaching staff or social workers, research students. I would strongly recommend you do the first aid training. It's something that I've done, and I have found it really rewarding. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and just
yeah, well,
press
I'll stop that. Let me just go stop recording. Stop.